September 1975, South Carolina. Dannion Brinkley was talking on the phone during a thunderstorm. Lightning struck the telephone line and passed through his body. His heart stopped instantly. His wife called an ambulance. The doctors pronounced him dead. They covered him with a sheet and left him. The resuscitation team was busy with other patients. He lay dead for 28 minutes. When he came to, the first thing he did was ask for paper and a pen, and he started writing. Not feelings, not impressions, specific events that had not yet happened. He wrote down 117 of them. Over the next 26 years, one by one, they began to come true. Chernobyl, the collapse of the Soviet Union, AIDS, September 11th. All of this he described in 1975. Before any of it happened, stay with me. Because the predictions are not the most unbelievable part of this story. The most unbelievable part is what happened to Brinkley himself after he came back, and what Raymond Moody, a man who studied NDE for 50 years and documented hundreds of cases, said about him personally after years of working together. Let's start with who Brinkley was before, because this is critical to understanding what happened after. He described himself without softening the picture. Harsh, aggressive, a man for whom other people existed primarily as tools or obstacles. He worked in a field where things got resolved through pressure and force. In relationships, he was guided above all by what he could get from someone. Compassion, a word he didn't just fail to practice, he literally didn't understand what it meant in any real sense. A closed door with nothing behind it, that was what he had, instead of the ability to feel another person's pain. His entire life. Until September 1975. After the lightning strike, the door opened. Not gradually, not through long inner work, instantly. And with such force that it almost broke him. But first, what he saw while he was dead. He described that at the moment of impact, he was literally thrown out of his body. Not a gradual dissolution, not a gentle separation, a sharp explosion from inside. He found himself above his own body and saw it from below, charred, motionless, with the phone receiver still gripped in his hand. He saw his wife trying to wake him. He heard her voice, but he felt neither fear nor pain, only what he later described as absolute silence inside, the first real silence of his entire life. Then came the tunnel. Not the blurry image from films, a physically felt movement through a space filled with vibrating sound that he described as something between music and light, as if those two things there are not separated but are one and the same. The speed was enormous, the direction was down and forward simultaneously, and at the end, a place. On the other side, he was met by luminous beings. He deliberately avoided the word angels. He had no religious upbringing that would have imposed that image. He described them as beings radiating simultaneously absolute knowledge and absolute acceptance. They knew everything about him, every action, every thought, every moment when he had deliberately or carelessly caused pain to another person, and they judged none of it, not because they didn't care, but because judgment simply wasn't their category. One of these beings led him to a place he called different things in different interviews: the Crystal Palace, the Hall of Visions, the Theatre of Knowledge. The substance was always the same. There he was shown what he called glowing boxes, something like screens in which scenes played out, not symbolic images requiring interpretation, specific events with enough detail that years and decades later they could be matched against real historical facts. He saw them one after another. There were 117. When he came to and asked for paper, he wrote down everything he could remember. These notes existed. People who were around him in that period confirmed that he was describing these visions long before any of them occurred. Now, the specifics. Because this is where the story stops being just another NDE account and becomes something fundamentally different. The Cold War at its height. The Soviet Union, a monolithic superpower that Western analysts considered unshakable for the foreseeable decades. Nuclear energy, the pride of technological progress, humanity's great hope for a future free of oil dependence. AIDS as a concept does not exist. New York, the most recognizable city skyline in the world. Brinkley, with no political education, no analytical background, no special knowledge of international affairs or medicine, writes down the following. An explosion at a nuclear reactor in a Soviet republic. A cloud of radioactive contamination spreading across a vast territory. The forced evacuation of an entire region. Long-term health consequences for people living nearby, for decades to come. This happened in April 1986. Chernobyl. 11 years after the notes were made, the breakup of the Soviet Union into independent states. In 1975, there was no obvious trend in this direction. The Soviet system appeared stable, the repressive apparatus was functioning effectively. The economic problems had not surfaced enough for analysts to be talking about any genuine threat of dissolution. This happened in 1991. A new type of epidemic, a disease attacking the immune system and spreading through blood and sexual contact. Millions of deaths worldwide before medicine understood what it was dealing with. AIDS as a distinct disease was not identified by medicine until the early 80s, 6 years after Brinkley's notes. 2 tall buildings in a major American city, an attack, enormous clouds of smoke and dust, thousands of deaths, and the sense that this day would change how America perceives its own security, permanently and irreversibly. September 11, 2001. 26 years after the notes were made. These are 4 of the 117, the most well-known, the most verifiable, the ones he spoke about publicly before they occurred, and which people who heard him confirmed. Raymond Moody met Brinkley shortly after his story began to circulate. By that point, Moody had already spent 20 years studying NDE, had seen hundreds of cases, developed a methodology for documenting them, knew how to distinguish genuine experience from the narrative a person constructs after the fact to give meaning to what they went through. He spent many hours with Brinkley, checked details, spoke with people who had known him before the lightning strike and after, and wrote the following about him, and this is a quote worth preserving precisely. Of the several hundred cases I have documented over 50 years, there are a few I cannot explain through standard psychological or neurological mechanisms. Brinkley's case is one of them, not because the predictions are proven absolutely, predictions can always be disputed, but because the transformation of this man is incompatible with any model I know. Trauma can soften a person, grief can open one, but not like this, not this completely, and not permanently. Now, the transformation. And here the story stops being a story about predictions and becomes something considerably more personal and considerably more inexplicable. Brinkley came back into his body and discovered that physical contact with another person caused him to feel their inner state. Not intuitively, not as a vague impression, physically in his own body. Another person's fear became his fear. Another person's pain became his pain. Another person's grief at a handshake became his grief. For a man who his entire previous life had been incapable of feeling even the pain of those closest to him, this was close to unbearable. He described the first months after coming back as the hardest of his life, not the physical rehabilitation from burns and nerve damage, though that was also severe, precisely this new capacity. He couldn't walk into a supermarket without being flooded by a wave of other people's emotions, couldn't shake hands with a stranger, couldn't be in a crowded space for more than a few minutes. Every person nearby was an open book, and he was reading it not with his eyes, but with his own body. Gradually, it took years, he began to understand that this was not a curse and not damage. It was a specific, unique capability unlike anything else. He was asked to sit with a dying man. Cancer. Final days. The family was there, saying the right things, holding his hand, weeping. But the man lay tense and closed off. Nobody understood why. A priest had come. Doctors had come. Nothing changed. Brinkley walked into the room, sat down beside him, took his hand. And in that same instant, physically in his own chest, he felt what this man had been carrying the entire time. Not pain from the illness, fear. An enormous, carefully concealed, exhausting fear of death that he hadn't shown his family because he didn't want to add to their grief. Fear that he had been carrying in complete solitude. Fear from which there was no relief because speaking of it seemed impossible. Brinkley leaned in and said quietly, so only the man could hear, "I know you're afraid. I was there too, 28 minutes, and I can tell you exactly, it isn't frightening, not at all frightening. It's better than you think." The man looked at him and wept, not from pain, not from self-pity, because someone had finally said out loud what he had been carrying inside, and had said it as someone who knew from direct experience. He died 3 days later, peacefully, without the tension that had been with him for months. Brinkley walked out of that room and understood. This was why he had come back. Over the following decades, he spent more than 7,000 hours at the bedsides of dying people, not as a professional with a degree and a protocol, as a man who knew exactly what happens on the other side and who physically felt the fear of each of them, and precisely for that reason could speak with them in a way nobody else could. Not consolation, not religious assurance, direct personal testimony from someone who had been there. He survived lightning strikes 2 more times, both times cardiac arrest, both times resuscitation. Both times he described the same space, the same beings, the same state of absolute knowledge without judgment, as if each time he was continuing a conversation that had begun in 1975, as if something there was waiting for the work to be finished and kept sending him back until it was. Brinkley died in 2013. He lived 38 years after the lightning strike. Until his last day, he continued working with the dying. Until his last day, he answered the question of whether he had proved anything, the same way every time. He said, "I'm not trying to convince anyone. Lightning struck me." And the next 38 years were the answer to those 28 minutes. Whether you believe what I saw is your right, but that I became a completely and permanently different person, that is not a matter of belief. That is something everyone who knew me before and after could see, and not one of them ever disputed it. Raymond Moody, in one of his last interviews, said about Brinkley simply, "I studied this field for 50 years. I saw many people who claimed to have changed after NDE. Dannion Brinkley is one of the few in whom I was certain it was true, completely, without reservation. Write in the comments, what in this story can you not explain rationally? The predictions about Chernobyl and September 11th written down in 1975, or a man who his entire life was incapable of compassion and came back with it so completely that he spent 7,000 hours beside dying strangers